want to try to call her again?
We're live. Good evening. Thank you for waiting. Welcome to the Sherborn Board of Selectmen meeting, May 30th, 2013. We have the town administrator is going to read the agenda for us first.
All right, 6:30, Town Administrator, reading of the agenda, which you just introduced.
Yes.
6:35, public comment. 6:45, Town Administrator report. 7 o'clock, we'll have Melanson and Heath, the town auditors, in. 7:45, Corey Lincoln, the town moderator, on a discussion on a vote from annual town meeting about a task force. Consideration of approval on warrant number 48 is scheduled at 8:05, and then at 8:10 we have discussion of future agenda items. And I just want to note that all these estimates, all these times are estimates, and items can be taken out of order as
Great.
deemed by the chair.
Thanks. Mike, do you have any amendments to the agenda?
I do not.
I'll take a motion to accept the agenda as written.
Move to accept the
I
agenda as
second.
written.
All in favor? Great, thanks. Okay, so that puts us into the public comment section. Yes, could you tell us who you are, Elliot, and where you live, please? We'll try to introduce that.
I live in Framingham and
Good
I
enough.
live in town. At town meeting, we are allowed 2 minutes to say our piece, which is absolutely illegal, ridiculous, absurd, and I think the selectmen should get the town moderator and town council to sit down at some meeting and find out that yes, it is illegal, you can't do it. If Elliot Taylor wants to get in front of the microphone, as long as I stick to the subject, I should be able to talk for an hour, which I would not do ever. However, to have somebody grab a hook and pull me aside after 2 minutes when I'm just starting to make my point is just illegal, outrageous, and I just want to smash someone in the face. When the town moderator said, Elliot, your 2 minutes is up, sit down and shut up. And so I think we should find out before I write a letter to the State Attorney General's office and the Civil Liberties Union. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take that under advisement, maybe do a little research on our own just to see what issues there may be.
We can look into it, and when the town meeting's going on, everything's the call of the moderator, but we'll see what else.
And there is a planning session with the town moderator that David attended and so
Well,
forth
before
before
the
town
next
meeting. Yep.
Public meeting, I
Understand.
want this 2 minute nonsense abolished.
You may or may not get that, but thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any other public comment? Well, hearing none, I think we'll move on to the next item, which is Town Administrator Report, and that puts us right on schedule.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Farm Pond opened for weekends only this past weekend. There was very light traffic most of the weekend due to rain. Saturday and Sunday hours are currently 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. The lifeguard staff is in place, and we're working out some other hiccups, but it looks like it will be a busy weekend this weekend. At some point, I'll bring in the Farm Pond Supervisory Team and the Farm Pond Advisory Committee to meet with the board and discuss some issues. The Memorial Day Parade this past weekend proceeded with good weather and was well attended. And Dover Sherborn Middle School will hold its Summer Arts Festival on Monday, June 3rd, from 3 to 5 p.m. at the school, and student artists and their accomplishments will be showcased. We will continue to monitor any open items left from town meeting. We emailed the article of update tracking sheet and the capital item tracking sheet to each board member for review. We will send out updated sheets as progress is made on each individual item. One capital item became an issue at last week's meeting and caused some confusion and concern when the board approved video recording the Western Ave intersection at Whitney Street, but held on a surveying proposal to lay out the design on a mock setup in order to test the design before actually constructing. I've sent you some updated information on this, but also wanted to give you a status update on where things are at. I've requested a breakout of the costs that made up the surveying proposal estimate. I've also requested clarification on the not-to-exceed amount in the proposal. Depending on the responses I receive, I may need to negotiate a more detailed scope of work and expense cap on the project if it's not already in that proposal. I've requested confirmation from the Traffic Safety Committee that a formal vote was taken to move forward with the videotaping and the layout of the intersection. I'll verify if a formal vote was taken and recorded in the minutes. I've been told that it has. I just haven't visually confirmed that in the minutes. If it was not formally voted on, I'll refer the matter back to that committee to formally act on it before moving anything any further. I do want to note that apparently this is an unusual setup with a citizen group advising an appointed committee and the committee in turn advising the selectmen. In the coming month, I hope we can look at how to better handle similar projects in the future and the setup of committees when we look at appointments in June. Also, in the past, the practice has been to hire a designer to engineer the drawing, then contract for the construction of the intersection. This modeling appears to be a new step that the selectmen may or may not want to weigh in on. If the town proceeds with doing the video and layout survey, bidding for the construction of the project will not include the added expense of a construction survey, as the surveying will have already been done. I do not recommend trying to do this work internally, but would recommend to the board that we move forward with the citizen group's recommendation to video the intersection and have the layout surveyed, providing the Traffic Safety Committee has voted to fully support this direction, that a detailed scope of work and competitive price are agreed on, and I receive an assurance that the surveying work will also serve as a pre-construction layout of the project so that the work does not get duplicated in bidding the construction costs. So for now, I just needed to know if the board would like me to proceed and keep you updated as to progress, or schedule this for discussion on a future agenda with the Traffic Safety Committee and citizen group being present so you can freely ask questions about the project, because I know that there have been different angles on this project.
Well, I'm not going to recuse myself because we're not voting on anything at this stage. So I think the key, there are two key things, is whether to leave it with you to handle the loose ends and deal with the timeliness factor here that may exist, getting this done before school ends to ensure there's adequate traffic flow to be evaluating and so forth. And the other thing is just to be sure that whether or not we should have something on the agenda. So I will defer to my good-looking guy on my left to see if he has issues. I know there are a number of good questions that you have raised, and so I'd love to hear, we want to satisfy your needs.
Yeah, and I'm comfortable with David proceeding as he just outlined. I think that addresses all the concerns I had the last time through. I don't know that we need to hear, you know, as much as we may have questions about the project itself, that's a project that town meeting approved, as I understand it. So I don't know that we need to raise questions or that we have any role in raising questions about the substance of the project. If there were, you know, a compelling public need to know more about the project, I suppose traffic safety could schedule a meeting and talk about it.
Well, over the last week, we definitely did learn a lot more about the project as it's kind of been building on the side and going through town meeting. We didn't really know a whole lot about what was going on, so I am at least more comfortable with the project now after spending the time on it, so.
Good.
It's in good hands as designed
I
for
think
him
so.
to carry
Yeah,
the
and
ball
I
on
think
this
those
sort of
steps that he outlined really
Yes.
squarely answer the issues I had, so.
thing. Sean, you had
Can I
something
speak
to add?
directly to that comment?
Sure.
The process after this, the test, is that there will be a formal presentation by Western Ave Intersection Committee, but more importantly, the engineers, to your board.
Okay.
Uh,
So
And
after the
combined
test
with,
phase.
combined with traffic safety. The intent was to get the test done prior to the end of school. We probably won't be in front of you before the end of school, but get the test done, so those two committees can meet again and bring it in front of you with the results. And then it's vetted, and you'll know much more about the project before, because it's been approved, but it hasn't been approved by you,
Right, and to the
the
extent,
project itself.
to the extent we had to authorize the videotaping, we did that last week, and that's approved, and that can go forward. And with David's proposed approach to the survey, I'm comfortable that he'll be able to take care of that and get a bid out and you know, or a price quote, and engage somebody before the end of school to do that survey work, if at all possible.
Great. Thanks for your input.
Thanks.
Thank
You're on
you.
the committee?
Sorry. I'm on both committees.
You're
I
on-
don't know why that one shut off. I'm
I
assuming
don't
it's
know
water
why.
up. Hoping it's water up.
Throw it out the window.
One last thing was a liquor license that was voted on and approved before. I just wanted to note, this was the Board of Selectmen approved a charity wine license for the Sherborn Community Center Foundation on May 9th, 2013. And I have the form that needs to be signed by the selectmen, and Mike was not
Right.
here at the time.
So we didn't sign back then?
There was one form.
Okay.
That was,
But we approved it, we just need to
Right.
do a signature, so
So I
you
just
can
wanted
get that
to-
from Paul, and you can get that from me.
get the signatures before
Okay.
the end of the
Yeah.
night. Yeah.
So we're all set?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we'll just sign them,
Thank you.
and,
And
go for it.
I was just gonna recommend that we take the warrant out of order and
Okay, before we jump to that, just to point out, Paul is hoping to get here by 7 o'clock. That's one of the reasons why we've moved things back a bit, and appreciate everybody's patience on that. It's gonna be worth the wait, and Corey's here, that's great. Just two other things on the upcoming events, or you weren't there yet, or you went through that, right? I would add two
Well,
things to the upcoming events, how's
I
that?
had one upcoming event.
Okay.
And there is the first day of summer that's coming up.
Yeah,
So,
all right, but we have the Sherborn Business Association Brew Fest. I know Elliot's not too happy about that, but
I
we've
certainly
been,
am not.
we've covered that ground, but that's happening tomorrow evening
May lightning strike.
at the Sherborn Inn. And next week, Thursday night is graduation night for all these wonderful high school kids that the town's invested in, and I understand it's a great crop, and Paul will be one of the speakers at graduation, so that's exciting. So we won't actually be having a meeting next week, but we'll talk about that.
Right.
All right, back to you, my friend.
I was just going to recommend taking the warrant out of order.
I think that's great. I reviewed it, and
Second,
so I move that we approve this warrant. You second it?
second, I reviewed it as well. Yeah.
All in favor?
Aye.
We'll sign that, and
Thanks.
away we go. Great.
Corey, did you know we're a half hour behind originally scheduled times? You're okay with that?
But you're in for a great learning experience here, Corey, so, which might serve the town well in what you have a responsibility for. Great, thank you. You want to cover anything else, or
No, I think that's it.
we could cover future agenda items while we're
Okay.
waiting for the 7 o'clock auditor
All right.
discussion?
You want me to just read each item that we
Sure.
were considering?
Sure.
Some of them, we haven't decided a date, and these dates are also subject to change. June 13th, we're looking for fire chief interviews. We should have something in the mail, the email to the board tomorrow laying out that proposed process.
Okay, so you'll include some questions on that one, right, that you've gotten some input.
Questions that,
We would send to the,
can-
yes,
yeah, and questions that you could ask live if you
Gotcha.
want. So.
great.
June 20th, we have a presentation scheduled by Kelly McClintock, and it's a plan for rejuvenating Sherborne's forests.
Right.
Like I said, the Farm Pond Advisory Committee would like to come in at some point about a pond management plan.
Okay,
Excuse me, that's to be decided.
great.
The Energy Advisory Committee is working on some energy efficiency issues.
Yep, perfect.
We're also, consideration of committee structure and annual appointments. We've talked about that a little bit
Yep,
as something that'll happen in mid and late June. And consideration of long-term financial plan committee task force. We were going to have that discussion around the same time.
sure. And you had provided to me, David, a sort of an agenda preparation process that you'd recommend, and we're gonna work through that, because we wanna be sure it's timely, and that the other gents get a chance to eyeball what we're putting on the agenda to.
Yeah, I think we need to move things up a few days so that
Yeah,
we
yeah.
can have a cushion in there for getting it posted and still being able to make changes before the
Right,
48-hour deadline.
right. Do you have any
I don't.
questions or comments?
No.
Terrific. So Paul, we've knocked everything off, and all we have left are the audit discussion and Corey. But to the extent you have some things to discuss before we move to the auditors who are coming in 5 minutes,
Well, I want to apologize to everybody for being late. I particularly thank the chair of the board for accommodating me.
well, everybody
The
accommodated.
audience, It was unexpected, but Joseph P. Kennedy III, member of Congress, 4th District, Massachusetts, was going to pay a visit to our fair town, and I had occasion to be with him and try and explain to him in a few words or less why Sherborn is a great community. Sometimes I feel like I'm Sherborn's #1 salesman, trying to explain what a wonderful community we are. And we are a wonderful community. There are just so many fine attributes. But this guy is up and coming, and I would not be surprised if Representative Kennedy ends up holding higher office, considerably higher office. I knew him down on Nantucket. I practiced law in Nantucket, and he had a stint of duty as a district attorney. He was assigned to that office. So anyway, I felt that was important, and thank you for
Well,
accommodating
I
that.
think we
We
have
didn't
to
have any
thank
Kennedys to
everybody
meet,
else.
so we
Yeah,
just showed up.
yeah, we were playing
We
cards
understand.
down the selectman's office for a while.
Well, who won?
Okay, well, that's great. I'm glad you had the chance to meet with the future, I don't know what, Kennedy and Congressman Kennedy. That's great. Great. All right, well, I guess we're moving along. We're ready to go to one of the highlights of the year is meeting with our auditors and having a little report. So Frank, if you could come up, and actually I was hoping Ruth would come up and sit with you so you're not sitting alone, for one reason. And for the other reason, if we ask Ruth a question and Frank
He's
gives
got
us,
all the
if he gives us a little look, we know we need to probe a little deeper, you know, on what you're answering, Ruth. But how about you introduce Frank for us, and then we'll take it from there.
All right, this is Frank Byron. He's with Melanson Heath, has been doing our audit for 6 or 7 years or longer. I don't know. I've lost track.
So Frank knows the town's finances pretty well, I would say.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, I'm going to let you start off, Frank. I know I'd sent you a few suggestions of things that caught my interest, if you
Okay.
will. But really love to hear what you have to say, and then the gents at this board. We have a new board member, Mike Jimo, who's joined the board with us, and we're excited to have him, and this will be his first go-round of this type of session, so.
And David, we haven't met.
And David?
Thank you.
Oh,
Just on
Um,
email.
My name's Frank Byron, I'm the president of Melanson Heath CPAs, and I'd like to walk through the highlights of the financial statements, and after I go through that, we'll talk about the management letter where we had a few recommendations for improvement.
Right.
I'll go through the financial statements from, beginning to end. I'm not gonna speak on every page, and certain pages I'm gonna have a lot more information to discuss. But if you have any questions as I'm going along, please feel free to ask as I'm going along.
Yep.
If you could turn your attention to the first page after the table of contents. And it's got the heading on it, Independent Auditor's Report.
Yep.
This is what we were hired to do, is provide an opinion as to whether the rest of this document, the rest of the financial statements are in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. And in our opinion, they are. So this is what's called a clean opinion. It's the best opinion that you can receive from an audit. In our opinion, the rest of these financial statements are in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles.
I noticed, Frank, the date of that is a few months earlier than it was last year, which
It
is good
is,
to see.
it is,
And we'll
and,
continue to work towards,
The
earlier.
town did a good job at closing the books and being prepared for audit. This year's audit definitely went smoother
Yeah.
than prior year audits, so
great, that's good to
it
hear.
was definitely an improvement. After the independent auditor's report, the next section, which begins on page 3 and runs through page 9,
Yep.
is called the Management Discussion and Analysis, otherwise known as the MD&A.
And just for that, we actually, those are our words, the town's words, which is usually Ruth and Pete Oglin, our treasurer, put that.
Right,
those
and
words together.
it's a narrative summary.
Yep.
It tries to put into words what the numbers say in the financial statements. So it tries to tell a story, whether the town had positive operating results or not, and it discusses some of the fixed asset policies and some of the debt policies of the town. A lot of that information gets discussed in this first section.
Yep.
I normally skip beyond this and go right into the number pages, but if anybody has any questions on any of this, I could either do it now, or I could come back to it after.
No, I think because the underlying financials have the same information where I would have those
Right.
questions. if
Okay.
any.
Then let's turn to page 10, which is the first of the number pages.
Yeah, that's
after
my-
that MD&A.
That's my favorite page, one of my favorites.
This is called the Statement of Net Assets, and it's presented on the full accrual basis of accounting. Now, this is really consolidation of all of the town's funds, where the town, in its general ledger, in its accounting records, actually maintains multiple funds, and it's required to by Mass General laws and generally accepted accounting principles.
Yep.
However, for this report, everything gets consolidated into one column, and then it gets converted to this full accrual basis of accounting. Now, the accrual basis of accounting is the same basis of accounting that a business would follow. And so what makes it different than the way the town normally tracks its accounting records is that there are long-term assets and long-term liabilities reported on this page. And you can see the long-term assets. They appear right above, in the middle of the page, you'll see the subtotal for total assets. And the amount is $40,228,947. Well, right above that are the non-current assets. And the largest of them are what's called capital assets, otherwise known as fixed assets. And they're broken down into two categories. One is the land and construction in progress of $10.5 million, and those are the non-depreciable assets, primarily land, but it's also for construction. And then the rest of the fixed assets, which include buildings, equipment, furnishings, things that are being depreciated over their useful lives, that's the other capital assets, adding up to $20,075,000. Now, this is the only place that you'll see these capital assets reported in the financial statements, is on this page. Similarly, long-term liabilities get reported here, and you'll see those about a third way up from the bottom of the page, right above the subtotal for total liabilities of $13.1 million. Right above that, you'll see three categories of non-current liabilities, the first of which is bonds payable, $7.8 million. Now, that $7.8 million represents a long-term portion of your bonds payable. It doesn't include what's actually going to be paid out over the next 12 months, excuse me, which is the number that appears a couple lines above that of $1,050,000. That's the principal that's going to come due during fiscal 2013. But the longer-term portion is $7.8 million.
And that total amount went down over $1 million of
Correct.
principal paid during the
Correct.
last fiscal year.
Exactly, yep.
Great.
The next line is accrued employee benefits, which is employee sick and vacation time. And generally accepted accounting principles require that a liability be reported for the amount that the employees would be paid if they were to leave the town. So that's what that represents. And then the next account is it's called the net OPEB liability. OPEB is other post-employment benefits. And this is a fairly new liability. This is the fourth year that it gets reported. And it's because of a fairly new generally accepted accounting principle that states that the town has to determine the actuarial liability that will have to be paid out into the future for its current employees and its retirees for health insurance benefits. So the actuaries came up with an overall liability, which I believe is just under $10 million.
Right.
They also came up with a 30-year funding schedule. That's what this statement, this GASB statement requires, is that there be a funding schedule. It doesn't require you actually fund it, though, and nobody requires that you actually fund it. The amount that you don't fund, according to that 30-year funding schedule, on an annual basis, is the amount that this liability gets reported in the financial statements. So
you're basically bringing in a year's worth of that amount not funded
correct,
as a liability.
correct.
So it's a portion of the full town's liability that other portion is not on the books, basically.
Exactly.
Can
So-
I restate that it's in my simple mind so I understand?
Yep.
Because he's the financial guy. This is
Yep.
a little bit technical. $1,347,000 is what we added to our liability.
The first 4 years.
Yeah,
That's the
4 years worth.
the accumulated first 4 years.
The accumulated first 4 years.
Right.
And the rest of the 10 million is not shown.
It will over the next 26 years. it'll take 30 years to get to that point.
But it's out there, it's just not on the
Correct,
page.
exactly.
So the other thing that I wrote on my little notes here, the things that aren't on here is that balance of the OPEB liability, so there's 8-something million not on here, okay?
Yeah.
The pension liability, the unfunded pension liability is not on this balance sheet, and that's another 8.5 million. There's nothing in here for teachers' pension unfunded amounts, because that's at the state level. I don't know what that number is, but it's a big number. And there's nothing in here for our portion of any debt at the region. This is just Sherborn's financials, doesn't include our portion of what we ultimately get responsible for from the region. So that's worth.
What's your
you know,
comment about the
just-
state, Peter? I don't follow that.
Teachers' pensions, and they have a footnote in the back. For Pine Hill School teachers, the state contributed for the Pine Hill School teachers to the pension plan $1 million this fiscal year. And basically, so we pay for the pension cost of the teachers out of our state income tax and state sales tax pocket, not out of the
It's
Sherborn.
not a town
It's
liability.
not in the Sherborn,
Good. Something that's not a town
appropriation.
liability.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Frank, if we put 100,000 away in stabilization fund.
Right.
Designated OPEB, that won't reduce this number because it's not in an OPEB trust fund?
It's not in an irrevocable trust fund, correct?
Okay, that's
Yeah.
all right.
And just since you've raised that, so this coming fiscal year 14, we've appropriated, not just moved cash around, we've appropriated 100 grand in the budget for money to go into that OPEB stabilization fund.
Right.
So we're starting to leak it into the budgets of the town. You know, the taxpayers, all they get and know about is what we report in here is the budgets, the
Right.
appropriations. So we're putting 100 grand aside. If we were to fund it under the funding schedule to make that $10 million liability go down to zero over 30 years, we would put away about 200,000. Because we're not funding it, the liability is increasing 400,000. So there's three numbers there that kind of double each other.
Can I follow up on that?
Absolutely.
The number right above that, the 252, 314,
Right?
is that the number that if we funded,
No, that has nothing to do with the other post-employment benefits. That's a different number. That relates to employee sick and vacation time.
okay.
Yeah,
So
not-
what
not
is the
helping.
number that we should, what is this current fiscal year's number? I mean, where would I find it? So if I was planning to do the budgets today,
Right.
where
Well,
would
the
I?
actuaries have that 30-year funding schedule, and
It's about 180,000. Correct me if I'm wrong, Pete, but I think it's about, if you were to spread it out over 30 years.
it depends on whether you fund it or not fund
Yeah,
it.
that's right.
Because if you don't fund it, then it's a larger amount each year.
It's
But
400 grand.
if it's funded, then then the actuaries assume there's gonna be some actual investment results that's gonna help mitigate the future costs. So I think that's why it would go down from, say, 400,000 annually being unfunded to maybe $200,000 if you were funding it.
Well, I know that during the budget cycle, Peter, you made the point that why don't we fund what our obligation is? And one of the things that I was hesitant about is, I don't know what that number is. It
Right.
never was clear to me what that number is.
Yeah.
But you're telling me it's not in here anywhere.
No.
There is a footnote that shows the change from year to year, but the 30-year funding schedule does not get reported in this report, but it's something that the town has.
And that's a lower number than the change.
That's correct. Half of.
Well, the funding schedule that you have right now from the actuaries, I think they're assuming that you're not funding it, so it's going up by about $400,000 a year.
But if we were to fund it, as we
They
say,
would
it's
do a different
180,000.
version of that schedule.
But that's
That
a
would be an
delta,
appropriation.
that's a delta of 80,000.
Not 220,000. Oh,
No,
no, it's
I
a
mean
delta
in
of what
terms-
we're putting away,
We're
yes.
putting away 100,000, and that's just a number I remember being at a meeting saying, let's put 100,000 away.
Yes,
It's just a nice round number.
right.
But if the actual number was 180, and we put aside 180. in
Into the
stabilization-
irrevocable trust fund is where it would have to go, though, yes. To meet that funding schedule that the actuaries provided, based on certain assumptions that many could pick away at because they assume high earnings rate and all that kind of stuff. So the real liability is probably more than 10 million, but don't get me
And-
going,
and
sorry,
what's-
Pete.
What's the actuarial assumptions, Peter? What are the
I
actuarial
think
assumptions?
they're 8.25% or 8.125%.
That's the
Earnings
return, but what about
That's
the
the
payout?
return.
What about the payout? Do we have some assumption in terms of employees?
Oh, yeah, they make, they do the census things. Pete, you could speak
It's
up at
updated
any
every
time,
2
but they
years.
take census and projections.
Yeah, they take the enrollments of people, they take the rates that they would pay and factor that all on in how long they would probably be employed by the town, how long they would live after they retire.
Yeah.
That's what the
And so they do a
does.
Sherborn-specific calculation, it's not a generic number.
Now, are we up for a new valuation this year, or is it? Yes, this year, so we'll get that.
So the number could be very different.
That's
Yep.
correct.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, sorry to sound like Johnny One Note, but just going back to, would you recommend to the town from a financial point of view, that we put 180, whatever the number is, estimated by Peter to be 180,000, away into that trust fund every year?
I would, because it's a liability that's not gonna go away, and it's gonna continue to go up, and,
And the advantages to the community, so all the voters can hear.
well, the advantage, I mean, you have a great bond rating right now. One of the advantages is the bond rating agencies pay close attention to that, and municipalities that fund it are looked upon much more favorably by the bond rating agencies. Of course, you're already looked upon very favorably by the bond rating agencies. But another reason would be just, it is a true liability, it's a real liability that's going to have to be paid out, and it's going to continue to grow. Right now, it shows up as $1.3 million here, but it's gonna continue to grow to $10 million.
$10 million.
At least that's what the actuaries are showing right now.
And that's as of 2010. If they do it again, wouldn't surprise me if they're gonna show 12 million. It wouldn't surprise me. I would expect them to show at least 12 million.
Which means the one usually comes to 60 or something.
Well, that's correct, yeah. So it's an important thing. The other way I would put it is also, Paul, that we're putting the burden, we've incurred the cost, but we're not paying for it. We're putting the burden on future taxpayers for paying for our liabilities we've created. Running this business of Sherborn. That's correct, that's correct. It's,
Great government principle.
I'm Johnny One Note on that one, Paul,
I have
so thanks for answering. Yes, sir.
one more question. Are you aware of any communities that are borrowing to do catch-up? Like they'll bond out the OPEB liability?
I'm not
or half of
aware,
it?
I'm not aware of any. It's not to say they're not doing it, I'm just not aware. The bottom part of this page deals with net assets, or the equity. It's really the difference between the assets above, subtract the liabilities in the middle, equals the net assets. So it's the excess of the assets minus the liabilities in total. And there are different components of those net assets. The first one is invested in capital assets, and the amount is $22.4 million. And that is really equal to the capital assets above in the asset section minus the bonds payable. So it's really just a calculated number. So the assets minus the bonds payable equals the net assets that are invested in capital assets.
Well, I note that you say under the financial highlights that our net assets has gone up from last year to this year by 235,000.
Right.
That's a good thing, right?
It, maybe. When you look at this page as well as the next page, this whole consolidated town-wide on a full accrual basis of accounting, it's not necessarily as meaningful in coming to conclusions as to whether things are good or bad. If the numbers were going way down, I think it would be an indicator that there's a problem, or if the numbers were increasing by a lot, it might be an indicator that things are going very well. But when you consolidate all of your funds, including your grants and your capital projects and your trust funds, they lose some of that meaning as to, is it a good thing or not when the net assets increase by, say, $230,000. So it's hard to say.
Well, increasing is better than decreasing.
Yeah, it is. But even if it went down, there could be reasons for it, such as you could have a special revenue or a grant, some dedicated monies that are being spent more in one year than the other, where it's monies that are dedicated for a particular purpose, and it doesn't really matter when they're spent.
But we don't have that.
Well, you have a few of them. There are a few. So the first of these net assets is that invested in capital assets. The next one is an example of what you do have, the grants and other statutory. These are your special revenue funds, $987,000, and that approximates what it was last year. By the way, that first number, invested in capital assets of $22.4 million, that actually increased by $600,000 from the year before. Now, keep in mind that that's what I said before, is that's a calculated number. It's equal to your capital assets minus your bonds payable. Your bonds payable went down quite a bit, that $1 million of principal debt service. So that in and of itself would mean that your net assets invested in capital assets should go up by about $1 million. But, you know, there are other factors.
But the other thing is, the capital assets reflect depreciation.
They do.
And that's one of the things that, you know, doesn't show up here in this
Not
baby.
in the budget.
In the budget,
Right.
is there was a $1.7 million of calculated depreciation
Right.
that reduced the capital asset amount up on the top there, so
Right.
there's a big slug coming out of the net assets.
The next couple categories of the net assets down below are the non-expendable and expendable. These are your trust funds, $967,000 and $2.1 million respectively. The non-expendable's approximately the same as the prior year, and the expendable is up about $300,000 from the year before.
Can you tell me what I was curious about, where this $2 million is?
What
That's
what
expendable.
specifically those are?
Yeah, so let's spend it. That's my first
Yeah,
thought.
it
If I
would
have
be-
$2 million.
That's where we look to Ruth to.
Yeah, your
Is that free cash?
stabilization fund balances would be included in there for one.
That's like $700,000 in these financials, right?
Any other,
All the library trust funds,
okay, that's a good,
all
yeah.
of the library.
The
That's a
library.
big number.
Yeah.
Conservation, the land acquisition.
So
stabilization,
those
Sonic
restricted
County.
funds,
It's all trust funds that,
but they're restricted. Some are unrestricted, some are restricted.
right,
They're all lumped together.
well, they're
The-
separated
Yeah,
down here.
the principal is the 967,000, and the income, the expendable ones are $2.1 million. But they're expendable, but they're restricted for their particular purposes.
Is that CPA money too?
We don't have.
We don't have any CPA money.
Yeah, the town didn't adopt a
Town
CPA.
voted against it.
Oh, good.
That's an issue that was quite a fight in the community. I think there was 2 efforts. The Hesses can tell us about it. I think they were active in that.
Well, we don't have it.
It was about 10 years ago, maybe.
What you're left with is the unrestricted net assets, the last of these categories, 492,071. And if you may remember from the prior year, it was a larger balance. It's down about $700,000 from the year prior. However, like I said before, I wouldn't necessarily look at that as something negative. There are just so many factors involved when it comes to the consolidation of all of the funds of the town that I wouldn't necessarily
See,
say
I
that.
struggle with that, because I feed right in on that one,
Yeah.
and actually that was nearly $3 million 2 years ago, so it's gone down $2.5 million in 2 years.
But I think your overall net assets
I mean,
is not going down. So
I
I think what's
understand.
happening is it's shifting from one category to the other, and it's most likely that first, the invested in capital assets, that's increasing as you're paying off your bonds.
Yeah, I gotta get my arms around, or my head around this one, because the other thing is, you're not here to talk about the region, but they're in a $2 million negative balance of unrestricted assets, and, you know,
And
there's another
a lot of
concern.
other towns are also, and, well, one of the legitimate reasons for that going down is that OPEB liability
Yes.
that gets reported, because that OPEB liability, which went up about $400,000, is an unfunded liability. So the higher that liability goes, the lower this unrestricted net assets go. So there's definitely a direct correlation there, about $400,000. So of the $700,000 that went down, 400's related to that OPEB liability. And what I was gonna say is, what we're seeing in many of our clients in Massachusetts is this unrestricted net assets for the last couple of years has been a negative number because of that OPEB liability that's increasing so quickly.
Yeah. So, Frank, before we leave this page, I don't want to talk about it too much now until we get to your last footnote, but it's the upcoming accounting requirements for pensions.
Right.
Knowing that the pensions aren't on here, but we're gonna basically see something even more severe than we're seeing with the OPEB
And now might be a
liability.
good time to discuss that. We have
Okay,
a
fine.
footnote on that, we also have a management letter comment on
Yeah.
it, just to give you heads up, but there is a new accounting standard, Government Accounting Standards Board Statement number 68, which is gonna be applicable in fiscal 15.
15.
So 3 years beyond this balance sheet date.
Yep.
And what the requirement of that is that the counties, your share of the county's actuarial pension liability, the unfunded pension liability, will have to be reported on this page. So where it's going to appear is right above or below that OPEB liability of $1.3 million. There's gonna be a new liability that's gonna be called the unfunded pension liability.
For the county? What do you mean the county?
Well, you participate in the county system.
So the Middlesex, okay,
Yeah.
okay. So
So-
our portion of that,
Correct.
okay, it's not like there was also this county
No.
liability of these employees that don't exist anymore, and we're getting stuck with that. No, okay. Hadn't been going there for a while.
And
So they're bringing in something big on that, right, quickly, aren't they?
the difference between the way the OPEB gets reported, the OPEB I mentioned before is an incremental. Each year you don't fund it, over 30 years it gets reported on this page. Different from the pension. The pension in 2015, the whole thing's gonna be here.
And that balance today is 8.5 million or something, right? 8 million, 8.1, yeah. So the whole thing comes in, that whacks all of, that puts
It does.
everything out of whack, right?
That unrestricted net assets certainly will go into a deficit at that point.
I mean, it's a liability that exists, it's just now putting it on the balance sheet. It's not that it's a new cost, it's a cost that exists, it's a burden the town has.
And this is a burden that's not growing, it's out.
Well, it grew $3.5 million since the last valuation 2-3 years ago,
Which
the pension
one? Not
liability.
the county one?
Yeah?
It depends on
Yeah, it was
the
4.5
investment
million,
results,
and
you
now
know,
it's
when the
8.
stock market crashes.
But we don't have any more county employees, is it?
No, it's
It's
we're
town
in the
employees.
Middlesex County retirement
Town
plan.
employees.
That's
Yeah.
for town employees.
Yeah.
Non-teacher town employees.
So
No,
that's still an active plan.
that's correct, yes. Yeah. Yeah, Ruth is gonna sail off in the sunset on that, assuming we keep funding it, right?
Oh, an investment.
You bet.
What's that?
Some good investment results.
That's correct, yeah.
With the stock market going up in the last year,
Yeah. Valuation should be there,
the valuation should go down, not up.
the liability,
Yeah,
Portfolio.
the actuaries have a way of what they call smoothing it out. They average out multiple years together, so one particular good or bad year doesn't have the same impact as the stock market going up or down in that particular year because they smooth it out over multiple years.
But correct me if I'm wrong, I read somewhere that certain parameters, if certain parameters apply to your pension plan, the assumed return, rate of return of, say, 8% that the thing's using today, that determine the $8 million liability the town has. They cut that down to in half, basically, if you meet certain parameters. I don't know if that's something we should be worrying about, or it's too early to tell.
Yeah.
Too early to tell. Okay,
No.
we'll get smarter about that, yeah. Okay. Thanks, Frank, for
Okay.
putting up with us on this stuff.
I was gonna skip beyond page 11.
Yep.
Can I ask you a page 11 question?
Oh, sure.
So you've got a change in net assets of
Right.
235,000.
Yeah, what,
I think we just heard from Peter, it was a negative 2.5 million. What's the difference there?
the 2.5 million?
That's the unrestricted net assets, this is total net assets.
Total net assets,
This
got
is
it.
the Frank was describing, all
Got
the
it.
stuff bundles together, yeah. And those expenses are GAAP, pretty close to budget for the most part, but you have depreciation in there too, I think.
Depreciation, and again, it's a consolidation of all funds
Yeah.
combined.
Yep. Yep.
All right, if we could go to page 12, this is a very important page. Page 12 is the balance sheet for your governmental funds, and this gets reported on a fund accounting basis, which is primarily a cash basis of
Cash,
accounting.
yeah.
It's the way that the town tracks its books, its general ledger. And the first column is the general fund, your main operating budgetary fund. And then you have the non-major, which is a consolidation of special revenue funds and capital project funds and trust funds. They all get collapsed into that middle column. Looking at the general fund, it starts off with cash on the top of $5.8 million. There, in addition to that cash balance, the town has what's called due to and due from accounts. And you can see the due from account right above the subtotal of total assets, about a third way from the top. You'll see the total assets of $6.7 million, and then right above that you have due from other funds of $419,000. And similarly, go down about 5 or 6 lines from that, and you'll see a due to other funds of $2.3 million. These due to and due from accounts are just like cash. The town pools certain funds into a main depository account, and in order to keep things accountable within the funds, it uses these due to, due from accounts. So really, a due from account and a due to account are just like cash. So you really, to know what the true cash balance is for the general fund, you need to take the total of the first line, that $5.8 million, plus the $419,000, minus the $2.3 million, the due to. And if you do that, the overall cash, I don't have the amount written down, but it's pretty much equal to what it was a year earlier. It hasn't changed very much from year to year.
But there is a comment that you made on page 4 that said, at the close of the current fiscal year, government funds reported combined ending fund balances of $6,493,000,
Right.
a change of almost $100,000.
Right.
Pretty good comparison to prior year.
Right, it is, and as we go through this, we're gonna see that most of the trends that we're gonna see, particularly for the general fund, are very good. The town had a good year. So going back to that first column, after cash, the next line is property taxes receivable, $459,000. That balance is very similar to the prior year. It's up about $35,000, not much of a change. There is a footnote on page 26 that provides a breakdown by levy year of those receivables, but for the most part, it represents a combination of the current year levy and prior year levies that have been leaned. So the town does a very good job at leaning in a timely manner. So these assets, these receivables are protected, so that if a property owner filed bankruptcy and had a delinquent balance, the town would get paid for those as long as they're lean. The town does a good job at leaning. That $459,000 balance is a very low balance, by the way. Compared to most of our other clients, the receivable balances are much higher than that. So the town's doing a very good job at collecting its taxes.
Right. That's our crack finance team, Nancy Hess. And Pete, you do some of the leaning, I think, don't you? Yes. There you go.
The middle part of the page, going down, are the liabilities, and the first is warrants payable. And warrants payable are another name for accounts payable. These are bills that were paid by the town primarily in July of 2012. They're related to June 30, the fiscal 2012 year. Accrued liabilities, below that of $498,000, is accrued payroll. Deferred revenues. Deferred revenues is for the most part an offset to the receivables above. When we take up above where I talked about that property tax receivables of $459, and then the next line is the excises receivable. If you were to add those together and then subtract what's called the 60-day rule. Generally accepted accounting principles say what you collect in your property taxes within 60 days after year end can be considered revenue for that year that just ended. So if you were to take those receivables minus what you actually collected within 60 days, it equals this deferred revenue liability. And as the name implies, deferred revenues, these are revenues that are deferred until they're collected. So when those receivables are collected above, these deferred revenues will become revenues. So
Isn't that a net number, like our overlay reserve is netted in there?
that's a good point too.
It's like 700 grand
That's a
debit
good
or
point.
something, I don't know.
That $400,000 balance, really, there are two accounts that make that up. One is the regular deferred revenue,
Yeah,
and the other is your overlay balance. Now, your overlay balance is actually more than $400,000. It's $639,000. Now, typically, so, which means in order to come down to 400,000, there's actually a negative deferred revenue of about 239,000. So you get the negative deferred revenue plus the overlay balance of 639,000 equals is 400. Now, typically, when deferred revenue goes into a negative balance, it's an indicator that your overlay balance may be a little higher than maybe it needs to be. So that's something maybe to keep in mind.
yes, we'll keep that in mind, won't we?
The next line is tax refunds payable, 319,000. This is an estimate of what the town may have to pay out in appellate tax board liabilities in the future. So it's people that have paid their taxes, so the money's come in already and been recognized as a revenue. However, the taxpayers are appealing it. They're looking for an abatement on those, and therefore to get a refund on that money. And the assessors estimated that the potential liability is about $390,000.
So that's in addition to the overlay reserve?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the assessors are looking at that as one of the reasons why they want to maintain that higher overlay balance. Because you have to, the overlay balance is like, it's a statutory account. And if you have any abatements or you have any appellate tax court cases that have to be refunded, they have to be charged against that overlay account.
But if I understand you correctly, and I don't need to understand it fully tonight.
Right.
We've got 640 in overlay reserves, and we've got 320 of this, so we're really looking at 960,000.
But you also have a negative
for-
deferred revenue of 239
Yeah, okay.
that nets it down. Another way of looking at it is what we call deferred revenue of
Yeah.
$400,000 is pretty much an offset to the receivables.
Yes.
They pretty much offset except for
Yes.
that 60-day rule
Yeah.
of collections. This 319 represents an additional liability that may have to be refunded for people that have already paid their taxes.
But it's not accrued yet, we don't know if we're gonna lose.
Correct, it's an
Is
estimate.
that the full amount of what's at stake, or?
It's the assessor's best guess as to what will actually have to be
The ones
paid
you
out.
think you're gonna lose?
Yeah.
is that what it
Right.
is?
No, she doesn't think she's gonna lose, but she's.
But that's their best judgment of a
But it's some
reserve to put on the
fraction,
books.
some fraction of the total. Okay.
You still have the communications.
Okay.
The last of the liabilities, other liabilities of 82,000 are various payroll withholding accounts. When we get down to the bottom part of the page, we have the fund balances. And in the general fund, that first column, there are three categories. The first is committed fund balance, and that's made up of two components. So that 696,000, half of it, well, 275,000 represents articles that
Uh-huh.
haven't been spent at year end, that are being carried forward to be spent in the next year.
Uh-huh.
The rest of it, which is $420,000, is your regular stabilization balance.
Not the
Not the
OPEB
OPEB.
stabilization.
Correct. The OPEB is reported in the column to the right of that.
Yes,
It's-
I remember that, yeah. Gotcha.
The next category is assigned fund balance, and that also has two components that are both exactly equal to each other by coincidence. Encumbrances, regular purchase order encumbrances, your budget lines that are being carried forward that weren't spent in 2012 to be spent in 2013 is 171,000. And the rest of it is reserved for expenditures of $171,000. The majority of that is free cash that was appropriated to be used to reduce the tax rate in fiscal 2013.
Oh. Okay. So that probably was a bigger number last year.
Correct. It was a bigger number last year.
Okay, good.
What we're left with is the unassigned fund balance, and the amount is $1,563,274. And this is probably the most important number in the financial statements. It's important for a couple of reasons. One is Department of Revenue, when they certify your free cash, that's the starting point of their calculation. Free cash is a calculated number. Nowhere in these financial statements will you see a free cash balance, because the Department of Revenue takes your balance sheet and they add and subtract things, but the starting point of that adding and subtracting is the balance that's in this unassigned fund balance. So dollar for dollar, the higher this unassigned fund balance is, the higher your free cash will be.
And that's consistent, we were at $1.1 million the year before, and we saw our free cash go up. Got it.
So it's important for free cash purposes. It's also important because the bond rating agencies pay close attention to this number. They like that number, the unassigned fund balance, plus your regular stabilization balance combined, to range from 5 to 10% of your operating budget. So this unassigned fund balance is $1,563,000. That is 6.5% of your budget. Your regular stabilization is another $420,000, which is another 1.7%. So those combined add up to $1,983,000, which is 8.2% of your budget. So the
We're in
bond
the
rating,
sweet spot of the.
you're right, you're just above the middle of the range that they would like you to be in. So the bond rating agencies would say that your fund balance, your reserves are in a strong financial position.
Good.
And a thing to keep in mind too, even with that regular stabilization, is that $420,000 is net of moving $300,000 into your other stabilization, your OPEB stabilization.
Which doesn't count in this
Not in this.
percentage.
Correct.
It counts in our minds a little bit, but not in the percentage.
So your fund balance is in a very strong range as far as the bond rating agencies would be concerned. That unassigned fund balance, by the way, of $1,563,000 is increased $441,000 from the year before. Now, unlike the net assets that we were talking about before on the whole entity-wide, the consolidated basis, there's a lot of meaning to this fund balance going up. This is what the bond rating agencies pay particular attention to.
All right. So I'm gonna cross out the word I wrote on the top of this statement. I wrote bizarre because I didn't quite follow it. I'm gonna cross that out.
But again, under the financial highlights section of the report, you highlighted that. So at the end of the fiscal year, unassigned fund balance for the general fund was $1,563,274, a change of $441,000 in comparison to the prior year. So that, doing rough math, 44 over 15, it's about 25% increase from the
It was a,
before.
yeah.
And I jotted down for myself a trend of where that unassigned fund balance has been for the past several years. And overall, over the last 7 years, it's ranged about where it is right now. It's had some higher years, it's had some lower years, but I think if you were to take the average over 7 years, it's approximately where it is right now. The bond rating agencies also like to see stability in this account, and that you have.
So there's no trend up or trend down?
It had been going down for the past 3 or 4 years, but it's gone back up now.
And this was a good year. We had a great surplus, as I would call it, excess of revenues and other expenses over budget.
And that's
so,
what we're gonna see next.
Yeah, gotcha.
Before we get to that though,
That feeds that.
on the next page I'd like to go over briefly is page 14.
14,
And the one thing I want to point out is on the first column, the third number up on the bottom, change in fund balance, $39,008, but it's in parentheses.
yeah.
For a business, this would be your net loss for the year.
Yeah.
Your general fund had a loss. Your revenues were short of your expenses by $39,000. Now, that doesn't sound good, But the thing to keep in mind is you used almost $1 million of your free cash as a funding source in 2012. And nowhere on the top part of this page where the revenues are, do you see a line that's called free cash, because free cash is not considered a revenue. It's money that's been earned in prior years.
So the money was used to pay for the expenditures, but we didn't show
There was no
replenishment
money.
of
Yeah,
it up
we
top.
did the savings to pay current expenses.
Yes.
So if everything else in your budget had come in exactly as anticipated, you really should have had a loss of $1 million. But you had a loss of almost break even, $39,000. So you did much, much better than your budget anticipated that you would.
Right.
But
But only because we
used
the
the
free cash.
the use of the free cash would have caused you to have a loss of $1 million. Now, when we go to page 16, that's the budget versus actual, and we'll see where the money came from to make up for that.
Yep.
Page 16 is the budget versus actual page, and there's two budget columns, an original budget and final budget. The original budget is the budget you open the year with, and the final budget is what you close the year with, and the differences between them would be any special town meetings that happen during the course of the year and reserve fund transfers that may happen.
And supplemental funding would be there as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's always that's a $300,000 number for us typically.
Now, the actual amounts, the amounts that are reported in that third column, get adjusted from what got presented on that previous page. So where I told you that the town had a loss of $39,000 and that there was no revenue line for free cash on that page, you actually have a revenue line on this page for free cash, and it shows up right in the middle before the total revenues and other sources. The line is called use of fund balance, and the amount is $959,841. And it's really put here only for comparative purposes. In other words, you budgeted to use $959,000, you use $959,000, so that you have a variance across to the right-hand column of 0. And similarly, on the bottom part of the page where the expenditures are reported, those actual expenditures do not perfectly equal the expenditures on the previous page, because these include encumbrances at the end of the year. So the town may not have a legal liability and may have encumbered some funds at the end of the year. Those get included in these expenditures on this page, so that when you look at the variances to the right of that, it's the remaining balance after what was spent as well as what was encumbered. It's the real closeouts of the budget. So going to that right-hand column and the top part of the page and looking at the subtotal for the total revenues, the amount of $362,328 is the excess of your state and local revenues over what you estimated. By the way, towns typically raise free cash. They recreate free cash by budgeting low on the revenues, with the hope and anticipation that
Yes,
the
we
actual
know.
revenues will come in higher.
We pushed that envelope a little bit, but a good thing for us to do, because now Ruth is doing monthly financial statements for us, and she had done one year-end in this monthly financial statement format as of sometime in July, perhaps she did it last year, for this fiscal year. So a good exercise for us to do, the town, would be to look at the numbers you showed in that and compare them to this actual amount column to see whether there are any significant differences, because it was preliminary. You qualified what you presented to the board as this is preliminary information, but we might learn something so that when you do the June 30th version this year, you could qualify further with a little more education. See what I'm saying? So, for instance, I don't know, if you had licenses and permits and you really blew it in what you gave us as of July 21st last year, but the real number when all was said and done was something different. You follow what I'm saying? We'll go over that. Okay, we'll talk about it later.
When we
You get what I'm saying.
when we do this,
Yeah.
the first thing that we do our calculations, and then the first thing that we do is we go to the accountant's books
Yeah.
to verify. Did the accountant come up with the same numbers that we did, just as a double check,
Yeah.
to make sure that, there wasn't something classified improperly.
And you would propose adjusting entries if you found them.
We would.
Were there any of material
Minor,
nature?
no.
That's
No.
good to hear.
I think there were only two really minor audit adjustments in the general fund.
That's good.
So the revenues beat the budget by $362,000. The bottom part, the second line up from the bottom, $471,938. That's the amount of the turnbacks, what the departments did not spend or carry over at the end of the year. The biggest piece of that, you'll see up above under the category of education, $258,000. That's the turnbacks from the Pine Hill School.
Which would include circuit breaker monies that weren't budgeted, correct, Ruth? Yes, because
Yes.
they used 40% instead of 70%.
And then another larger line, you'll see $131,600 under the category of employee benefits, which I think is primarily health insurance.
Yeah, I don't think we'll see that this year, Pete.
The only line that's in parentheses here is transfers out, $7,812. And it's not really an over expenditure. What it is it's a return of monies that were transferred to the general fund from some of your special revenue funds that weren't all needed, so they were returned. So that's what that represents.
Yeah, so Frank, just so we're smart about what we're looking at, this year, this financial statement shows a total surplus, as I would call, 834,000.
Right,
The year before, that number was 400,000.
right.
In 2010, it was 640,000. So it does go up and down.
It does.
I imagine for 2013, we won't experience this kind of number.
Well, the goal is always at that bottom right-hand number, which in this case is 834,000, should equal to or approximate the use of fund balance, the use of your free cash that you used that year. Because you want to be able to recreate what you're using, because if you don't, then your fund balance is going to start going down, and you're going to get out of that threshold of fund balance that the bond rating agencies like you to be in.
Right.
Now, in this case, you used $959,000 of free cash, you were able to recoup $834,000, so you were almost there.
Close, yes.
So it was a very good year.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing, by the way, with the use of free cash, that the bond rating agencies, they like you to use free cash for one-time only type projects and for capital projects, not to reduce the tax rate, which I know the town has used it to reduce the tax rate. And you can do that, but the bond rating agencies prefer you not to do that.
Well, this budget season, Ruth, it would be fair to say there was a concerted effort to reduce the use of free cash to reduce the tax rate.
Right.
And so we had a couple of years where we really desperately needed it. This past year, we were able to be a bit more creative about it.
Should we be working to make our estimates for our budgets better? I mean, you're saying our revenues were actually almost 400,000 more than what we used to set the budget, and then our expenditures were almost $500,000 less than what we budgeted.
But the
Shouldn't we-
majority of the turnbacks on the appropriation side came from those two lines, the school department, and the health insurance. And had it not been for those two lines, the rest of the numbers are really small balances.
What I'm saying is, just take the school line, for example. I don't mean to pick on the Pine Hill School. We got a school committee member back there who's gonna kill me afterwards.
He's the chair now.
But does that, could it be said that essentially we appropriated $250,000 for the schools more than they actually needed, and then when they didn't spend it and didn't return it, that proves that they didn't actually need it. So when we go to next year, instead of taking their last year's appropriation, we should take last year's appropriation, deduct the turnback, and have that as the starting number.
It would be logical to look at that.
One of the key chips in the game here.
His hand is up.
Yes, Frank's gonna- but before Frank, you speak, is how we treat the circuit breaker monies, anticipated or otherwise, is one of the pieces of the puzzle here. And and the school administration, and I would argue the school committee, and I'll let you speak then, is uncomfortable with using too much anticipation of the circuit breaker money particularly because the town, this includes the town's portion of circuit breaker monies related to regional school students in out-of-district placements. And you can get killed if somebody moves into town and you haven't anticipated that, and the school likes to have a little wiggle room there. So that's all I'll say, and I'm sure you can speak more precisely about
I
it.
mean, right, because these funds are dedicated funds. In other words, we could use those funds for something else. So unless we had kids that qualified for that, and there's, accountants, as long as up one arm and down the other, to take a look at all these figures, we can't use that money unless it's for someone who's an out-of-district placement, whose cost is more than 4 times the average cost of a normal student's
Right.
per pupil rate. So unless we qualify for that, we cannot use that money. So, I mean, you're using the money differently than you did a few years ago. We can take a look at that again if you like. But the way it is now, unless we have students that qualify for that money, we cannot use it. The way I
So-
look at it.
So what happened, Paul, a few years back, the town never used to anticipate circuit breaker monies. It would come in and would show up here in a $200,000-300,000 slug. And then, when I was on advisory, we started anticipating a portion of the circuit breaker monies where the reimbursement rate used by the schools in the town was 40%, when the state provides 70% or whatever it is. And so there's still more to come, but the more to come that wasn't reflected in anticipated circuit breaker monies is a cushion for unanticipated needs.
Right, because you have students that will move in, particularly like say from out of state, and it could be a student that might cost you $150,000.
But it's still a discussion. You had a budget planning session the other night that I was invited to, and the topic came up of how to treat that and so forth. And the superintendent almost threw a stapler at me, but,
She didn't have one.
but she didn't have a handy, yeah, and I ducked.
And it's not in the budget.
That's right.
So Frank, explain what you mean by it's not available otherwise. Does that mean this money doesn't really exist?
Well, it exists, but it's not like, so that if the kids don't arrive, and need that particular money, we just can't take it and spend it. I
So
mean,
so
if
what
it
happens to
exists,
this,
we will.
what happens to this 258,000? It just goes away?
Oh, no, it goes to the general fund.
It goes back to the general?
Right,
Yeah.
in other words, that's the surplus he's talking about. So
It
it's not
becomes part of
really,
your free cash.
Free cash.
it's not really a surplus that we budgeted too much for.
But my point is, why do we have to add that 258,000 to the budget? Why can't we reduce the budget by maybe 50,000 or?
Well, this year,
We have to
this year,
take a
we,
look at the way we use the whole fund.
yeah, this year, though, we did, Paul, we used an additional 20,000 of anticipated circuit breaker monies to get everybody to the comfort level on this of use of free cash to offset the deficit.
But all I'm
So,
saying is, that isn't there more in there that could be used for?
Well, there may be, yeah, there may be, and I think that still is a discussion we need to continue to have.
Yeah, it's just a theoretical discussion, I'm just trying to understand the numbers. I'm not opposing anything, so don't get too violent. I'm just trying to understand, I mean, the same thing with employee benefits. If we budget like $1.9 million and we only spend $1.8 million, why not just appropriate $1.8 million and not have to collect taxes for $100,000 more than we're gonna be spending? We're taxing ourselves for that $130,000, even though when it's not spent, it flows back to free cash and can be used for something else. But in terms of taxpayers, why not fund things at what they actually need rather than?
Well, we also did that, and Pete was cooperative, reluctantly so, I would say, and I don't blame him. But we snagged, another 20 or 40,000 out of what he was projecting. It's a little bit of voodoo magic when you're projecting your benefit needs, not knowing your population that are demanding benefits, because it depends on spouse changes and
We
all that stuff.
actually,
So
at town meeting, we had to supplement
yes,
that line. And then you took it away, you took
In the
25
budget.
grand away out of the budget for this year, so
no,
it's liable.
the town took it away. I'm just the guy sitting
Well,
here.
the one that was thin. So you can't, it's one of those things that you just, you know, it depends on who signs up.
But I think your point's well taken, so we under budgeted it
Right,
for this past fiscal year,
After
because
we
you had
got-
to supplement it for FY 13, because you needed supplemental, because more people joined the plan than Pete's projections anticipated. So it is a challenge, Paul, but your instincts are absolutely right, to continue to look for that, so you don't wind up, you know, when, I remember before I got to this board, and when I was sort of early on advisory, and the board was congratulating Ruth for a $700,000 surplus, and I'm thinking to myself, gosh, we've overtaxed. So there's been an effort to try and smooth out things a little bit, and yet leave a little bit for the rainy days. How's that? Poor Frank's caught in the middle of all this. He's like, whenever I go to this town.
You're not supposed to overtax.
Yeah.
Peter,
Yes,
can I ask a question?
absolutely.
I think I've heard you say that the OPEB situation, if it's in a trust fund, it's better for us because the actuarial thing is less. But at the same time, you're talking about the most important number of all that the rating agencies look at, and that number would be less if we had that money in the trust rather than a stabilization. Which is more important?
Well, you know, the bond rating agencies like that range of 5 to 10%. You're at 8.6%, so you're in a good range when you look at that unassigned fund balance with your regular stabilization. The bond rating agencies would like you to be doing something with your OPEB. So something is better than nothing. So as a starting point, I would suggest it may be better to put something into that irrevocable trust for the OPEB. And I think the bond rating agencies would look upon that favorably. Not to the point to make your unassigned fund balance go below that 5 to 10% threshold, though.
Can I add something to that? The town already approved setting up the
We have
irrevocable
the-
trust.
Yes.
The trust,
I think the longer you go without putting money in there, they
Agreed.
could start looking at it and saying, you just set it up, you're not putting anything in there now, what's your problem?
So that'll be a fiscal 15 item, whether we do that, and I think there'll be more appetite to do that, particularly since we've at least put a $100,000 placeholder in the appropriation. Bumping it up to 180 or 200 makes sense.
You could hold a couple car washes.
Why not? Thanks, Frank. What else?
That summarizes the numbers in the financial statements. Beyond this page is the footnotes of the financial statements. And some of the more important things in there, I think we've discussed already, which is the
Yes.
other post-employment benefits and the new GASB that's coming out to deal with reporting that liability for the pension. It's going to be applicable in 3 years.
Right, so when I look through these financials, one of the first things I look at is the information about, what amount was contributed to the teacher's retirement. It's $1 million, that's at the state level, and for the region, it was over $3 million at the state level. So the point why I keep harping on that, it's just the cost of the business of Sherborn, it's just not captured in this baby, if you follow me. And likewise, the $1.7 million of depreciation is a cost of the business of Sherborn, but it's not captured in our budget. We're not fully paying for it here. But, yes, sir.
One of the other points that was in the financial highlights section was that the town's total long-term debt at the close of the current fiscal year was $1,075,000 less compared to the prior year.
That's right.
So isn't that also, that's a good thing?
It is. That's your bonds payable went from 8.9 to $7.9 million. And it'll be down $1 million less at the end of 13.
So we are paying off our debt.
You're paying off your debt aggressively.
And
But then we add to it,
Yeah.
depending on what
Yeah, we did
we just
add to it.
added $1 million something to it, right, Pete? Yeah.
But I represent communities that have $100 million debts,
Right.
$60 million debts. So can you say in comparison with other communities, this is quite a reasonably low
It is,
debt
it is.
amount?
Is there a percentage of the debt capacity? Is there a way of figuring?
Well, there probably is, but I'm not that familiar with
No,
that.
But I think we have significant debt capacity from what I understand, right? Much, I mean, we're just a fraction of that.
Yeah,
Not counting any of the legacy liabilities, just pure debt for capital items alone. We have a lot of room.
But the problem is, it's the same as you talked about before, it's just putting off. for
That's correct.
Future generations.
But it is fair to summarize this whole thing by saying we have more cash and less debt.
you do. Your fund balances have improved and your debt has gone down, exactly.
And that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is
Yeah, all
definitely a
right.
good thing, yeah. The numbers in your financial statement, there's nothing in there that indicates anything negative. If anything, it's mostly positive numbers. Your receivables are a very low balance, and you're doing a good job at aggressively collecting and leaning them. Your fund balances have improved over the prior year. You have a stabilization fund, you have another stabilization for your OPEB that got established during fiscal 2012. And you did very well on your budget versus actual. Your revenues came in better than anticipated. You had turnbacks on the appropriation side. And your debt, your bonds payable is down $1 million, so everything is very positive.
Yeah,
That's
great.
what I'm,
Well, Paul's been trying to get to that, he wants to do that, we definitely,
I want the
and we have
big
we have a good team, the
for our
folks do a
voters.
good job, you said we've done a good job. You had a management letter with a few
Yes,
comments,
we have a management letter now.
nothing really makes me lose sleep, reading this, I do, other than you're talking about preparing for that pension GASB,
Right.
that's the.
You know, if there were serious
That's the
issues,
scary
we would have to mention them in here, and we would call them either material weaknesses or
Yeah.
significant deficiencies. Those
Yeah.
are, you know,
Yeah.
for the major problems, and there are none identified here. So the issues that we mention are areas where we think the internal controls could be improved, and/or maybe just efficiencies be improved.
Yeah.
But there, I agree with you that these aren't what I would consider to be serious breakdowns.
But we take them seriously, it's not that, you know, the town's gonna fall apart here, it's that, these are good issues that you pointed out, and you typically pick a couple of departments to
Correct.
beat in on, to see, for instance, you picked the transfer station, you picked, I don't know, the school lunch or whatever it was, and, you do that every year, you pick a area.
Different
to
departments,
focus.
correct. Yeah,
That's
and
good.
there's typically is always something that we'll find at these departments, because they're decentralized and because they're, the accounting records are maintained by people that aren't typically accountants.
Yes, that's right, yeah, we are decentralized and all that.
the
So I
part
defer to you guys, if you guys have any questions for Frank, or thoughts, or comments.
the part that I was concerned with was about cash handling at the remote locations.
Yeah.
I'm not comfortable with that. You've identified the transfer station
Right.
as a place where cash is being handled, and our remedy of having a better ledger prepared essentially at the transfer station
Now, there are other
suggests to me that's not really a control. There's no checks and balances. If someone is pocketing money at the transfer station, I'm not saying there is, but if someone was pocketing money at the transfer station, this wouldn't pick it up.
But what we're suggesting here is at least have two sets of eyes looking at things, so that, you know, one person who might otherwise be inclined to do something devious, knowing that somebody else is looking over their shoulder, might not do it. There are other things that can be done with transfer stations. We've seen other towns where the transfer station doesn't handle currency at all.
That's what I've been,
Like a voucher system or something like that.
Right, you could, what we've seen other towns do is, you have to buy vouchers here at the town, and those vouchers,
That would
get
make a lot
turned
of
in.
sense, actually.
But David, you're kind of looking into some of this stuff, right? You've been working with Nancy, you've been working with other folks to, Pete, to,
Not specifically on the transfer station, but the handling.
what the
cash.
handling of
Yeah.
money at remote locations and so forth. So you're trying to get that pulled together, which would be good.
Yeah, I had a sort of a simple check and balance. I mean, if you pay, if we collect 100 tires, and we charge a resident $5 a tire to dispose of it, and then it gets shipped to a disposal site, and the disposal site sends us a bill, but it's not, what did I say, 100 tires?
Yeah.
They send us a bill for 150 tires, and we only got revenue for 100 tires. Alarm should go off. But where in my mind there's a problem is that I don't see where we are doing the audit connection that connects the fact that 150 tires is being paid for disposal, and 100 tires were received for purposes of cash receipts. How do those two pieces of the transaction get reconciled?
And I think you're right, that I don't think that process is happening right now. That connection is not being made right now. That I don't think anybody is going through and proving that the tires that you're being charged for is the same number of tires that you billed for. One of the things that we include in this recommendation is that there be internal audits done, which would be your accountant go visit not just this department, but any departments that receive cash and do some testing similar to that.
Yeah, we adopted a policy to that effect 10 years ago, 15 years ago, so that's already on the books as something that's supposed to be happening.
We are currently doing internal audits.
You're doing some,
We
right?
have a list of departments that we're doing, and we have no time on our hands to fit them all in. But no, actually, we are doing that. We just haven't done the transfer station because you recently did it. So we're, working through departments that hadn't been looked at by the auditors, and we've gone through maybe half of all of the departments.
So will you be doing a report for that
Yeah.
at some point?
Yeah,
That would be
at some point.
interesting reading.
I think for sure.
If Frank did the transfer station, did you check to see if 100 tires went out?
No, I don't think we did.
Well, what internal audit did you do at the transfer station?
Well, it would have been looking over the receipt records primarily, not necessarily reconciling that to what you got charged on the disbursement side. It would have been looking to make sure that as the monies come in, that they're being recorded, who's paying what, whether it's in the form of currency or check.
But how do you know that 100%? So let's say 10 people arrive,
Right.
and I work at the transfer station, and I take money from 15 people.
Right.
I record 10 in the books, and I put 5 in my pocket. How does your audit pick that up?
Well, what our audit suggests is that the controls are not great there right now, and that there is that opportunity to happen right now. And so what we're suggesting is that the controls be tightened up over there by at least getting 2 sets of eyes involved through the whole process, so that, one person couldn't get away with something, the other person would see it.
But that second set of eyes is looking. So let's say I have slippery fingers, and 15 people come in. I put on a piece of paper that 10 people paid.
Right.
Now I give it to him, and I say, "How many people paid?" He says, "Oh, 10 people paid." So we have 2 sets of eyes looking at the piece of paper. That's great, but how does it pick up the fact that the paperwork doesn't reflect what's actually happened, particularly if you're dealing with cash? Because one of the policies we had decided was there should be no cash at these remote locations. And instead, somehow we discovered, I just learned this year that cash is being used at these remote locations.
Put it on a credit card.
No, but couldn't we, Frank, just accomplish part of what Paul's trying to achieve by some pre-numbered multi-part receipt, so that
Well,
Individual
to me,
gets
the
it
best
and
would
track-
be no currency.
well,
Yeah, well, that's what,
but that then
we
becomes,
adopted that as a
whether
policy.
that's practical or not for the person that comes in and says, I wanna get rid of my tires, and, oh, you gotta go to town hall and
Right.
pay a voucher, and it's like, so, I don't
think
know.
there are-
Well, that's something we can work on, that's a good job for the,
Well, I think there are a number of issues with the contract that hasn't been enforced, and that expiring contract needs to be renegotiated.
okay, let's not go there, but you're absolutely right.
But those controls can be placed in there about the recording and access to records.
Well,
and that
I was
kind of
only using that as as an example. There are other places where we had, this Board of Selectmen had voted back 10 years ago or so that there would be no cash at these locations. And somehow that's become now a situation where cash is being accepted there. What is wrong with our going back to what we originally said?
We couldn't find that vote, by the way, Paul. I think I'm correct on that. Is that right, Diane?
You can find any evidence of it.
But I think he's raising a great issue that we should look at and come up with. This new board figures out what it wants to do based on recommendations from our favorite town administrator and the finance team, right? Because, you're collecting cash, she's collecting cash, it's all, I was pointing to the back of the room. Yes, sir, Elliot.
Yeah, back to this transfer station. How much time and paper can we afford to spend to make sure that everything is collected properly at the transfer station?
That's a very good question.
And a thought that just went through my thick head was maybe we could have a credit card down at the transfer station. People can say, here's my 3 tires, put it in the credit card, bang, and then we get a bill from the credit card company.
That's good points. That'll all be factored in terms of the level of effort and administrative burden versus the cost benefits and so forth.
Yeah, I'm less concerned about people having to plan ahead and more concerned that we don't have issues, whether it's the transfer station or any place. I'm not assuming we have any issues any place, but we ought not to take that chance. We can set up systems that ensure we don't have that issue, and I think that's just a prudent thing to do.
Yeah, this was an issue when you sent your management letter and I saw, wow, I didn't think the recommendation of having another pair of eyes looking at a sheet of paper that's secondary to actual cash handling really addressed the problem that might arise from the handling of cash. Because if the cash never makes it onto the page, no matter how many eyes look at it, you'll never see the cash that didn't make it to the page. It's the audit where we have to pay to dispose of 150 tires and we only show income for 100 tires. That's where you find it.
Yep.
And that's the part that's missing. It's randomly or systematically, that part is missing.
Well, that's something we can figure out.
Yeah, I was just going to ask on, I know the role of the auditors changed. We talked to you year-round. I think it's the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that created a line of how much you can advise or direct the
Right.
town to be doing.
Yeah, that's more, there are independence issues.
But we have to come up with internally, like they say, there's a problem there, but if you choose this is the way you're gonna do it, then here's how you can mitigate the risk. But, it's up to us to look at what best practices are and say, this is what we want to put in place. Do you think there would be a problem with that? I think that's how it's.
Well, typically, we would identify during the course of our audit that there's a problem. We might make a recommendation, but it's really your
It's our burden.
responsibility to determine exactly what you want to do to,
But to the extent, we come up with a 5-page report that says this is what we ought to do in the various areas, I'm sure you'd find that interesting reading.
oh, absolutely.
Your experience would be valuable to us to say, you might want to
Right.
consider something else.
Yep.
Yeah, that would be great. Any other thoughts or questions for Frank?
No, this was very exciting.
This was exciting, wasn't it? I think it was great, Frank.
And I
I appreciate your time on this. I appreciate everybody sitting through this. Ruth, thank you. Thanks to the finance team.
And you were very clear, I appreciate that too.
Yeah, we learned something
And
tonight.
like I said before, the town did a very good job this past year. The audit went much smoother than it had in the previous couple of years, but of course, the previous couple of years, the town was going through a computer conversion also, and there's always difficulties involved in going through that. But I think this was the second year after the computer conversion, and things went much smoother.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Frank.
Thanks for
All right, thank you.
Terrific. All right, so next we move on to one of the highlights of the agenda. Corey, come on up to the
No, that's fine.
friendly seat. Well, because people might want to hear what you have to say. I know
Oh,
our viewers, they've tuned in just for this part of the agenda. And so it's best that you come up and,
You get to sit down at this microphone.
they're comfier seats. No refreshments served, but we're working on that.
Actually, I came to hear what you all had to say. The charge at town, the article at town meeting turned out to be quite specific when I read it. And the phrase in the first sentence in parentheses is, after consultation with the Board of Selectmen. So I am here to consult with the Board of Selectmen and to hear what you all have to say, what your concerns are about process, about what will happen during the course of this committee's life, any input you have about the method of selecting the members of the committee, and if you have some specific suggestions, you can always email. I'm trying to handle as much of this by email as I can. I have an application, and the press is here, good. I have an application form on the town website, and I asked people who were interested to fill it out and return it to me by June the 7th. So if you all have any suggestions of specific names, if you care to mention them tonight, or if you just want to email me, I'm cclincoln@verizon.net.
Okay. All right, well, shall I take a crack at
Sure.
things first, and then Jens, I'll
Sure.
turn it over to you?
That's the chair. You're the chairman.
I got this thing right here. All right. No, so I saw your application, which is on the website, and I
Right.
think that's great. And I don't know if you've gotten any in, but I sure hope you do. I think, the task whether you wanted it or not, you've been, burdened with a task, and it's an important task. So your success and this committee's success, or task force success, I think is critical for the town. So I have 6 things on my little list to mention, okay?
Sure.
One, because after consultation with the BOS, I hope that it doesn't end tonight, that we have periodic consultation as we think might make some sense. So that's one point I'll make, okay? You don't have to necessarily answer, but just I'll share my thoughts. So I hope that our consultation can be ongoing to the extent it's valuable to what you need to do, okay? And I would have a question whether, what is unclear is whether, when you have applicants, whether we would jointly review those applicants at some time, just to weigh in with each other a bit on that. And I hope we get the opportunity to do that, okay? The task force arguably would be working off of a blank slate of what they're charged with. However, there certainly was a lot of work and effort put in to trying to adopt some of what the task force is doing. So there's that as a resource, not as a framework to follow, but as a resource to the extent folks need to talk to people up here or in town hall. I would suggest excluding certain types of folks. It's your charge, but I would suggest not having on this task force folks who might be conflicted, and I use that term loosely, okay? But that would be considering not including elected officials. That's a little bit open. Maybe not including folks who are appointed who have employees that report to them, because there's a little bit of there could be a conflict. So I throw this out for your consideration. I would argue not having employees, town employees on there, whether they're elected officials as well or whatever. And I would also be wary of anybody that says, I'd like to join, but I will only join if such and such is certain to happen. So anybody with preconditions to joining, I think, skews them a little bit, and I would think that they might not want to be there. Groups that I think you certainly could be looking for expertise, I referred to this as a early on, it was an SOS initiative. Its configuration may have changed. But the folks have spent a lot, the folks of SOS have spent a lot of time, so I suspect you might get interest from one or more folks there, and I think that would be a good resource. I think even our revenue enhancement folks, if they're interested in a little more volunteerism to the town, some of those folks are pretty, have good insights into what, the world at large. The personnel, the folks on the personnel committee have a lot of the organizational structure, finance, and human resource capacity that may or may not want to be additionally burdened. The last thing I would suggest is that whatever this task force is, that it periodically reports to the world at large how they're doing, so that they're, to the extent there might be a suggestion to go in a slightly different direction or also look in another direction, that might be useful to their success. So those are my things. And you can comment or not, and then I'll turn it over to my friends here.
Well, why don't all three of you, and you
Perfect.
might have some overlapping comment.
Perfect.
Sure.
Mike?
Yeah,
Go for
I
it.
mean, I can weigh in, I don't have a fancy list like Peter does, but, and I actually anticipated and agree with a lot of the ones that Peter put forward. I'm not entirely sure the committee starts with a blank slate. I mean, I think it's pretty specific that the DOR and the Collins reports are a starting point, so from that standpoint, there is some background. Like Peter, I think I'd be, a little concerned with people who may have a vested interest or are conflicted in some way being on the board. I might even extend that to people who have had very specific preconceived positions on particular issues. I think this committee is going to be more valuable if the range of options is very open and it works through it from a variety of perspectives. I assume they're going to be open meetings. I think, I would think this board and
Would
probably
be subject to open meeting law.
and probably others in town will be represented in some capacity as observers or interested in the work of this committee. I don't know if it will work out this way. It would be nice if whatever arrives out of this committee is something that can get buy-in from lots of various constituencies in town before a town meeting. My concern or fear is that there's going to be different groups proceeding on parallel tracks again. That's, to me, one of the shortcomings of establishing a committee like this through a warrant article is it sets it up on a little bit of a pedestal, but in fact, unless it has buy-in and consensus from others, it's not really going to be a fruitful exercise. It's going to be a lot of work, and we're going to get back to where we were this year. So those are the thoughts I had anyway. And I might send you some specific names. I don't have any in mind right now, but.
Okay, thank you.
In my past, I worked for 3 speakers of the House of Representatives, and sending a idea to committee was how you killed an idea. And so
That's exactly.
the most important point that I feel I can make is I hope this is not an end to the idea. There is an opportunity here. Yes, a lot of work has gone on for 2 years at the board level, staff level, and with Collins and DOR, but now it's in the hands of this committee. And if they view their role as being the traditional committee type that I've seen so much on at the State House, then I know that it's just a cosmetic thing for this to die and be buried. I want a committee that's actually going to feel that this charge is different, that let's get something done type of charge. So that would be my first and most important point. The second point is that the charge refers to the DOR and Collins reports, and there are documents that are reports. But I would include in reports the fact that we brought them in and they have said a lot to us and answered a lot of questions and amplified a lot of what was in the reports. If you just go back to the written reports, if you interpret this narrowly, I think you're missing, or the committee members would miss a wealth of material that got added to it. So then the question comes up, how do they get access to all of that? Well, it's all been on television, it's been at meetings, but they're spread out over a lot of different occasions. And sometimes the best quotes, the best insight occurred not in the written form, but when they were here and you asked them a question and you put it right to them, the verbal statement was more powerful, clearer than things that are in the report. So my second point would be that I would read the word reports as not limited to those two documents, but to this whole body of advice and consultation that this community has had the benefit of over that period of time. And again, how do they get that? Peter and I sat through much of that. We are available as a resource. And I don't mean to exclude Michael. Michael's,
I'm happy to not be a resource.
but we actually were there listening to all this, and we can tell people where to look and where to find things that weren't part of the report but came afterwards or in response to questions. So we'd like an opportunity, or at least I'd like to have an opportunity to work with the committee to make sure they have all the information. The third point I would make, and I think Peter has made it before, there are different models for a committee. It's very easy to create a committee that's going to have two that are of one view, two that are of another view,
Two pros, two cons.
two pros, two cons, and one guy in the middle. You see that sometimes in arbitrations, where the union picks a guy, the management picks a guy, then you have one guy in the middle. That really brings the committee down to one person. And I'm hoping that you don't go with that model. Instead, you go with a model of 5 open minds, of people who have literally no agenda at all. The charge says 5 registered voters with competency in these different areas. What it doesn't say, and which I'm hoping that you'll add, and I want to underscore what was said before, that they're not soldiers in this fight that's been going on. They haven't been suited up in their armor and slashing away, because those are the people who are going to apply. Rather, as a guy who's tried cases, and maybe Mike is in like the same situation, we want a jury, just like you'd pick a jury. If we're going to have a trial, you want a jury of people who will listen, will be open-minded, who will consider the pros and cons, and yet people with enough stature in the community that they will put the community first. Not the selectmen first, not any town department first, but put the community first. So we want people, if there are any, who have open minds, who are credible, but who understand the importance of community. And that brings me to the last point, which is that we as a board and our consultants have seen that the recommendations really boil down to to making certain parts of our government smaller, and in the process thereby saving money. And there are more than just numbers. We're talking about people, and we're talking about their jobs. And so those people who might be affected got upset about their jobs possibly being eliminated or merged and whatnot. It's from the consolidation that the taxpayers may save money. And so the advice from the consultants was to try and grandfather people in and phase this thing in so that the impact on individuals would be a little bit slower, a little more for the taxpayers to pay over a longer time, because you could make fast savings right away, but rather respect those people. And so we want people on this committee who are compassionate and who are sensitive and who will also carry out the notion of caring for these people, because they're good people. And it's sad to think that somebody might lose their job or whatever our consultants are saying need to be done to save the money and make it more efficient and all those kinds of things. But compassion, respect for people, I would put as a high qualification here, in addition to what's set out here. Because for one person involved in this, I'd like to have a result that's acceptable to everybody, that benefits the taxpayers, that doesn't harm the office holders, that everybody can buy into, that makes sense and moves the community forward. So those are my thoughts.
Oh, we've laid a lot on you there, Corey.
Well-
When he's talking resources, I just have to make it light, but if anybody wants me to go over this beautiful piece of work, I'm here for it. Wait,
But that's why I want you
But-
to
No, I
factor
understand what
into
you're
this,
saying.
that
There's-
somehow we'll have a chance to
Yeah.
make presentations.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, this is in many ways analogous to the past 6 years that I've spent appointing people to the advisory committee and to capital budget, because my priorities in selecting people have always been that they're intelligent, that they're open-minded, that they're collegial both with each other and with the various town employees that they're interacting with, and also that they are well-tempered, that they are only making recommendations, and they execute their task by persuasion. And in fact, this committee, its end product is going to be, we hope, things that will be potential warrant articles that would then be voted on by people. And you would hope that what they have has been well vetted, well considered, that lots of people have had the opportunity to have input in it, and that would be widely acceptable, hopefully, before it actually, encounters the vote in town meeting. So I think that I've always looked for those characteristics and would continue to do so with this committee. I don't think that you can always rule out people that are interested. My personal rule has been that I like people who are interested. I don't want a committee full of people who really were dragged to the table, because you have to have a few passionate people who are going to drive the process and make certain that it's well done, it's efficiently done, that they're going to meet timeline points as they go along. I think that the key is to avoid people who, as I describe it in advisory and capital budget, have a particular axe to grind. People that I don't believe are going to be open-minded, that seem to have their mind made up beforehand. And I think in this case, one of the reasons why this wound up coming on the moderator's plate was that I think they're looking for people who are not of direct interest in the possible outcome of what's going on. People who would have been directly offended by the, not offended, but directly affected, I'm sorry, by the proposals that have already, circulated and that were some of the warrant articles. And in fact, that does include the selectmen. I think that you obviously have a wealth of background and information because you spent so much time dealing with this issue, and that you're a good resource. But I think you need to have, to some degree, although consultants to the committee in a sense, but I think it's actually going to be helpful to the outcome if you're seen as having a bit of an arm's length relationship to the committee. I think it will make its outcome be more generally accepted. And I certainly feel that we're starting off with the Collins report and the DOR report in its written forms. I've also pulled copies of the past two committees that we had in town studying the restructuring of town government. And I certainly think that any of the input you all have about having participated in the discussions with the DOR and with particularly with the Collins people, that would be helpful. Other than that, I think I'm generally trying to hit kind of a good demographic of some people who perhaps have a fresh eye on the structure of town government. I think we do need to have some people who are historians of town government, know how it actually works now, know where a few of the bodies are buried. It is a political process to some degree. And find some good men and some good women and people who have some specific skill sets. And I'm looking forward to all of that. I have gotten applications from some people that I expected and some people that I totally didn't expect. So it's been very interesting, but I certainly welcome input. I've also had people contact me, and I really appreciate this, with good suggestions of people that they think would be good contributors. And it's even better if the people have been sort of sussed out a little bit to see if they might be interested in doing this. The deadline that I have on the application is June the 7th, so I'm kind of looking to have my list to work from at least within the next week or so, if you do have suggestions.
Could I suggest that before you finalize an appointment, that you allow us to comment if we know that someone has been actively engaged? You may not know that, and your source might not tell you that, but we could give you whatever. I mean, you don't have to follow our reaction, but we know a lot of people in town.
Sure.
We interact with people in town, and we can. I know where people stand on a lot of the issues, and I'm hoping, well, again, to use the trial model, when a jury is selected, the lawyers for the different parties have a right to ask the judge to disqualify a particular juror because they were robbed the week before, so maybe they are a little biased when it comes to trying a robbery case. That type of thing. So if we have any factual information that we could, or comments about a particular person, we could give that to you for your consideration.
I certainly would welcome your comment on it. I might not have the same perception of the bias that you would. I would welcome your input. In the end, I would make the decision, and I would hope that once the decision was made, that everybody would go forward with the 5 people that we have.
I would expect to respect that, for certainly. And
I still didn't hear from you whether you anticipate reviewing with the Board of Selectmen or consulting with the Board of Selectmen about the people you're going to appoint. This is a very general session. It seems to me the sense of this vote was the appointments come after consultation with the Board of Selectmen.
Yes.
Still your choice. It's still your appointment.
Yes, and I am perfectly happy to consult with you about who the people are. In the end, the appointment is mine, but after consultation,
so
certainly.
you'd be open to coming back again when you've basically shuffled your cards and have a good sense of where you're headed, and we can talk through that
If
either
you want to.
offline or in this
Probably should be in
environment.
public.
Yeah, I think in public would be
Sure.
helpful, so if you're open to that, that's great. I mean, I totally respect what you're doing, and we're here as a resource, and again, reiterate that we want your
Yeah.
success, you know, so, and this committee's success. You wrote me, I'm here because you wrote me into advisory 7 years ago, whatever it was, so,
This was your exit strategy.
so, yeah. I don't know, so I won't hold that against you, how's that? Elliot, you have
You know,
something
3
quickly?
comments. First thing I wrote down, you just discussed, this is her committee to
Yes.
appoint
Yes,
with your assistance, which
consultation.
you will definitely assist with. So we know that. This committee should report to the selectmen by about December 1st, so that you can take their comments and put them on the warrant,
I don't think
next
we've gotten
year,
that far.
which closes January 1st week thereabouts.
I think this says report to the town within 9
9
months
months.
for draft warrant articles. So
Okay, that's already in the.
that's in there, so that sounds like
It's in
by
there.
next March, they would anticipate a report to the town.
Yes.
Well-
So
And
maybe
it-
it
and
wouldn't,
it-
Well, this is, if we're gonna put it on next year's town
well,
meeting,
it might
But
not
it's
be.
got to be in by January 1st week.
He's making
And
a good point
therefore-
that our timeline is earlier than 9 months.
But this is not set up, Paul, necessarily to get on
The
next year's
next
town
annual
meeting.
town meeting.
It says to consider at a subsequent town meeting.
So you read the 9 months to the meter to start once the committee's appointed? Is that
Well,
what you're
even if
interpreting
you
versus
interpret the
9
meeting,
months from
even
this
if you
vote?
interpret
If it was
it
from town
9
meeting,
months
it's
from
still-
May,
It's still February.
it's, yeah, and,
Right.
and it does not specify which town meeting, it just says subsequent. So
Well,
I am living by the letter of what the motion said.
well, you get my point, that if it's gonna
Yes.
go on next year's town meeting,
If,
you guys have gotta scrutinize it, sometime during.
I think a lot of people have to screen.
And the other question is, if someone wants to get on this committee, who should they contact?
Me.
There's-
They should contact the town moderator and
Yes.
not bother the selectmen's
Who-
office.
It's
Yeah.
right on the form. It says how to
Okay.
contact her,
Okay,
her email
okay.
address.
And that's
Very
on the
good. You-
town's
you've answered my
website.
question.
Thanks,
Thank
Elliot,
you.
those are good questions.
Yeah.
those are good. Anything else, gents? Corey, anything else we have to do? or-
No, just
Kumbaya, we're saying kumbaya for now, right?
send those names.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks
Sorry
a
about the
lot,
late hour,
Corey.
but thanks.
Yeah, thanks, we dragged this meeting out here, it's my fault, I apologize. So I think that's all we have, we've done everything we needed to do. Do you need anything further, Paul?
Well, just talk about the previews of coming attractions.
We did that.
We did cover
We did
that,
that?
but if you wanted to circle back on anything on the agenda, please feel free to do so, Paul.
Quickly.
Did we talk about Farm Pond being open? and-
In the town
Yes.
administrator's report, I reported that the hours were 10 to 6, Saturday, Sunday, weekends only.
We talked about the Brew Fest tomorrow night, we talked about graduation next week, where you're speaking, Paul.
My
Which
daughter's
is exciting. Yeah, congratulations, that's huge. That's the community's invested in these fine students, finishing up their high school careers, that's a big step.
That's-
One of the
that's-
last unconditioned classes that goes through
It's-
Dover.
It's character building.
Yeah, that's right.
When I went through school, there was no air conditioning and no heat. So
I walked miles to school, I don't know about you.
uphill both
Yeah,
ways,
yeah.
right?
All right, all right, so,
This June 20th, how to rejuvenate Sherborn's forests. I would love to know just what that means.
well,
but
come to that meeting,
come to
Elliot,
that
all right, you'll
I-
find
I
out.
make the announcement
This
here
is
for
just
the
a
TV
teaser,
audience.
this is just a
Okay.
teaser,
I
bring
think
you.
it's by putting bark mulch around the trunks of the trees.
Oh,
That's how
God.
they're planning to rejuvenate.
All right.
That's because
You
at
would
every
have to
meeting you tell
mention
us
that.
that bark mulch kills trees.
You
And
would
he's
have
right
to
on that.
mention that.
He's right on that.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All right, before we adjourn, I just want to thank you for bringing your efforts and your expertise to this table. The town's in a better place because of it, so I really want to thank you. All right, all in favor? All right. Finish it.